Welcome back to the online summit series, Yoga Beyond Exercise, Conversations to Heal and Lead Us into the New Paradigm of Peace, Harmony, and Prosperity. My name is Julie Upton, and I'm your host. Today's guest is Dr. Michael Cotton. Michael is a leading theorist in the evolution of consciousness, culture, and the brain. He's the director of the New Human University and the creator of Higher Brain Living Technique. He has more than 30 years experience in personal and cultural transformation and has introduced us to the source code meditation and the 9 summits of transformation. I hope you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. Good morning, Michael, and thank you so much for joining us here on the online summit series, Yoga Beyond Exercise. Welcome.
Good morning, Julie. Grateful to be here.
Yeah, I'm grateful to have you here. So, Michael, I'm enrolled in your Pathway to Awakening course, and what inspired that after, 25 to 30 years of a yoga practice was your energy and your clarity on the importance of waking up that prefrontal cortex and how this is the evolution of the new human.
Mm-hmm.
And that's my kind of whole thing is enlightenment. That's how I got into yoga and Buddhism in the first place. And this idea that we're in this evolutionary process as humans.
Yeah.
So how did you get into all this? Maybe give a little background about who you are and then kind of just talk, because I know I can listen to you like all day.
Okay. Well, I know we only have an hour together, so I'm going to keep the about me as short as as short as possible. But what's been almost 3 decades ago now, I had what I describe as my waking up experience, and that's not exactly the same experience as what I understand or describe waking up or enlightenment states now. But for all practical purposes, it was a profound shift in my being and a profound shift in my reality. And I had gone through most of my life a very stressed out, anxious child that bumbled his way through high school, barely getting through, ended up going to college because I was told you're supposed to go to college. I had no purpose I had no idea why I was going to college, but I did. I flunked out. I got thrown out of college after my first year with a 0.57 GPA, which is hard to do, but I did it. And I started taking minimum wage jobs, and my life was about, to be honest, drinking beer and partying and hanging out and living for the weekend. And I had no direction and no purpose. And somewhere along the line, I was actually 26 years old. I was in my latest nowhere job in a steel and aluminum factory. And I had been feeling this kind of something bubbling up inside of me that was indescribable, but it was kind of shaking, like something was going on that I could feel was leading to something changing in me, and I didn't quite understand it. But I had a defining moment, what I call the real waking up day or experience or moment, where I had this transcendent consciousness that not only it was like I could see myself as an object, I could see myself standing in that steel and aluminum fabrication shop, but I could also see my history. And I could see this path, this nowhere path that had put me in this nowhere place. And I could see clearly where that was headed. And something inside of me just felt this empowerment rise up in this kind of transcendent state of consciousness. And I felt this empowerment in me that I was so much bigger and so much better and so much more than this little finite thing, going to work and drinking beer and living on for the weekends. And I had this, just what I call this, just radical shift in identity that put me in this flow state that I left the job within a matter of days. And I started to try to figure out what was going on with me, what was happening inside of me, where was I going in life. And I was just in this massive flow. And I started to read everything I could read about human potential and self-development to try to understand what was happening to me and in me. And it led me down every path imaginable, from Zen Buddhist practices to how quantum physics correlates with Zen Buddhist practices, to life coaching, to developmental psychology, to energy work, to just the whole spectrum to yoga, to meditation, to contemplation, to these deep spiritual approaches. And I felt within that I didn't know where my path lie, but I knew that my path was within human potential some way. That was my new life. And I started to just devour information. I mean, it was ridiculous. It was like this massive flow state of just integrating tons of high level information. And I started to notice this pattern when I started to dig really deep in how modernity, or modern humans, were utilizing so many of these ancient techniques, whether they were, energy-based techniques or contemplative techniques or meditation practice. And I found a kind of hard, I guess, truth to swallow. Not a lot of people were really waking up, I mean, in a profound, life-changing way. They were having some state experiences. They were changing, they might become a little more happy, but there wasn't the profound transformation that so many of these paths promised or taught. And I started to look at what were the most well-known, deepest spiritual paths. And I found in all of these traditions, these wisdom traditions, there was this esoteric core that took people to these higher levels, and in one way or another almost always involved some type of contemplative practice or meditation practice, often combined with or in association with some kind of energy capacities within the body. And I started to study this, and I was trying to figure out why, these ancient texts were full of these kind of anecdotal, profound transformations, but people just weren't having it. And I started to look deeper, and I started to find out I don't really think most people were having it back then either. I was finding things in like the Bhagavad Gita that I can't remember the exact quote, but it says something like it's 1% of 1 millionth that actually finds it, or some such thing. And so here was my breakthrough. As I'm trying to understand all of this, I'm trying to integrate all of this information, I'm trying to find out what happened to me. I read a book that was part of this path. It was put out by Omniscience, called The 3-Pound Universe. And the 3-Pound Universe was a play on the brain. The human brain weighs approximately 3 pounds, and so it's a whole universe. So that was the title of the book. And I started to I read a chapter in that, and I had just a crystallizing moment. And I went, modern neuroscience has only revealed the relationship between the brain and the mind, or the brain and consciousness, or the brain and higher consciousness, or the brain and enlightenment. It's only understood that there was any sort of connection in the last 50 or 60 years, and really only in the last couple of decades has there been any understanding of the actual what we would call separation of the two spheres, or I call dimensions, between the mind and the brain. So here's the point. I don't want to get down too esoteric of a path with this, or technical of a path with that. But integral theory, or integral meta theory, has now demonstrated that the brain and mind are not the same thing. They are in relationship, they have associations, they are connected, but one does not reduce to the other. You can't find the mind inside of the brain, which is a fallacy of so much of modern neuroscience. But the other side of that is true. They arise in this kind of non-dual relationship where they impact each other. But the brain, here's the key distinction: the brain itself is a physical object. It has mass, matter. There's blood flow that can be measured. We can look at parts of it under microscopes. We can look at it in MRIs. We can measure EEG wave patterns. All of these are physical, objective things. But the mind itself is what's actually doing the looking at the brain. It's what's understanding all of this stuff about the brain. It's not really the brain. And so the mind is subjective, not objective. The mind is part of your, what we call interior or interiority. It does not have simple location. It's not an object that you can measure with a MRI machine or put a ruler beside a lobe of the brain. The mind is subjective. And so here was the breakthrough. Every single one of the world's wisdom traditions, that some of them developed over thousands of years, had no knowledge that the physical objective brain was in association with these higher mind states or enlightenment states or awakening states that were sought. So all of the techniques and ancient spiritual technologies developed. Now, yoga is the exception to this with some of its body-based practices. Well, there's other exceptions, but the point is they still had no knowledge of the correlation between higher brain capacities and higher mind capacities. One affects the other. And so you take and even yoga was designed, for samadhi. It was designed for meditation. All the contemplative paths were designed towards contemplation or meditation in one way or another, with no knowledge that the higher brain was part of the story. And so we developed these practices, and what I call them, these meditation practices, as mind-on-mind practices. We developed these ways to use our subjectivity, to focus our attention, to look at our mind, to look at our thoughts arising, or witness our thoughts arising, or even focus on a mantra. All of this is interior-based mind-on-mind stuff. And all the while, we don't recognize that the physical brain is impacting what we can actually do with the mind. So what I found is that we have to find a way to impact both the brain and the mind just as our starting point. Because here's one last thing. I'm sorry, I'm getting a little technical. There's one last piece, and then I'll stop and let you direct me. But one last piece of that is that humanity has evolved what we call the lower brain, and it evolved that at a time when the environment was full of predators. And that lower brain was designed to keep us safe. And it keeps us safe by habituating sameness. If we find some way to have shelter, to get food, and to not get eaten by a predator, the lower brain is successful, and it will habituate those patterns over and over and over and over and over again. So that lower brain, the thing to remember, sameness equals safety to lower brain physiology. So that's a key point to remember. Sameness equals safety. The lower brain actually wants your life to be the same. If you're alive, whatever it did worked, right? Even if you don't have purpose, even if you're not in your perfect relationship, even if your career isn't meaningful, the lower brain doesn't care about those things. It habituates sameness because sameness led to your safety. Mm-hmm. So here's the thing. As evolution proceeded, the lower brain was maintained. That's how evolution works. It doesn't abolish what came before, it builds on top of it. So our brain has layers. Now, here's the thing. The highest layer is the prefrontal cortex, and it's more complicated than that, but for simplicity, the prefrontal cortex and this whole new highest layer apparatus, a relatively recent evolutionary development in the species. That part of the brain has to be engaged, has to be energized. We have to shift out of lower brain physiology into higher brain physiology, because it's the higher brain physiology that is the corollary to the higher mind, to the higher states of consciousness, to these awakenings that the meditative and contemplative states we're striving for. The problem is that if you don't understand the brain physiology, it's in this lockdown state of trying to protect you. We have never totally energized this higher brain. So we bring these aspirations, we bring these meditation practices, we bring this desire to awaken, and we start our contemplative practices or our meditative practices, but we're doing it into a brain state that doesn't want to change. And so if your brain doesn't want to change, how much mind flexing, focusing, meditation, contemplation is it going to take to finally get the shift in the mind? Well, the answer is, for most people, you just never get there, right? You spend, I mean, you look at the studies that have been done on like the Dalai Lama's meditators and that have been done in academic universities to measure brain state changes. When they select them for the studies, most of them have had 30 years of a minimum of 4-hour-a-day meditation practices in controlled, deep settings in a very deep tradition, right? And I'm suggesting that the reason it takes so long and is so hard is because using the mind to change the mind is like asking the fox to guard the hen house. The mind is the whole problem. That we come in to try to transcend that monkey mind or that stressed mind or that anxious mind or that depressed mind, or just even that normal mind that we want to go beyond. But it's hard to use that same instrument to change itself, which is what meditation does. So I said I was going to wrap this up. I'm sorry, I'm getting excited here. But so what has to happen, I'm going to stop there. What has to happen if we want to get rapid, sustainable, integrated change, we have to awaken the brain and the mind, not just use the mind to change the mind. And if we can do that simultaneously, if there's a way to awaken the brain, to shift energy into those higher brain states, meditation's ready to go. The brain has prepared itself for the meditation. And when we put the two together, awakening the brain and using meditation to awaken the mind, then we've really got something. So I'm going to stop there.
Well, I think that it's a lot of great points. I mean, as a meditator and being a part of many meditation communities for a long time, even the Buddha said that, I mean, he didn't use the word Buddhism, but it was only going to last for 2,500 years. And I think that he foresaw that the human evolution of the brain was at play. And it makes sense to me, because sitting and watching the mind for so long, I mean, if you haven't done that, and I am one of those contemplative people, I have lived in the cave, I have meditated for 4 hours a day, and there are things that didn't happen within that practice, so I had to shift it. And that had a lot to do with emotions. And that's one of the things that I noticed within the spiritual communities. It was a hard balance between like normal emotional stuff coming up and not bypassing it. I know that we've talked about that in the course. So could you talk about like how the normal person accesses these higher brain states? and then deals with everything else that needs to happen in order for us to awaken.
Yeah.
And then, of course, we'll want to talk about what is awakening. What are we awakening to? And
Yeah.
why is it important?
That's a great question. So I'm gonna try to unpack those. I'm gonna answer the first one and then let you push a little more into the what is awakening after I do. But I want to take just a moment to first. I didn't want that to come off as sounding somehow critical of these wisdom traditions or meditative or contemplative paths. It's only critical insofar as this is simply how evolution works. They could not have known what modern neuroscience has only revealed in the late 20th and 21st century. They simply could not have had access to that knowledge. That's revealed over time through deeper understandings and through the evolutionary process. And so they were intuiting genius level understandings. And they got us to this point where you and I can be having this conversation. So I want to be very clear. I want to honor those traditions. Without those, we didn't have this place to jump off from. And the work that they did to get us here was enormous. And I particularly love the quote by Isaac Newton, who said, I stood on the shoulders of giants. And so he said, don't give me all the credit for my scientific discoveries. I stood on the shoulder of giants that got me here. And that's how I feel about this. And so now I lost what your question, about the emotions and stuff that come up. And so well, you know what? I think I'm gonna try to unpack both of these questions together, because I think that they tie in what is awakening, because I think it's all part of the process. And so I'm gonna, and also for everyone out there that has a different definition, that's fine. It's just to have a conversation, we have to sync up our definition. So I'm gonna find define what mine is, which I suggest everybody does. It's one of the things I found can be so problematic when you're having conversations about enlightenment or spirituality or awakening. Sometimes you find that there's two different songs in two different heads, and we have completely different ideas or definitions. So I'm just going to sync this up so that you understand where I'm coming from when I say this. And so awakening, to me, and what I think is fairly consistent with the higher, where Patanjali was headed for yoga to ultimately end in meditation and samadhi, where all of the world's, where the Buddha was headed, where Christ consciousness was headed, where all of these wisdom traditions and their esoteric cores or tops were headed for, was this waking up or enlightenment state. Now I'm going to use that word state, and it's important. Because I'm going to make a distinction in a minute. But state is the ability to have a transcendent experience, and I actually have defined 3 awakening states: a soul awakening, a transcendent or transcendent self-awakening, and a unitary awakening, also called non-dual or non-duality awakening. Just for sake of not getting overly complex, all this waking up state, generally speaking, is the process of shifting self-identity away from the core body-mind complex or ego body-mind complex that we usually associate our identity. When Julie says, I am Julie, or Michael says, I am Michael, or whoever else, that I am that they're referring to is usually this gross physical body with the subjective ego mind. It's our everyday self that we navigate the world with. But what we know is that we're more than that. And through Well, our work, but what these contemplative paths and traditions aimed for, was the realization that the I within you does not exclusively end or reside in that body, mind, ego complex, and that you can experience a state that plunges you into the part of your I, the part of your mind. Remember, the mind is subjective. You can find that the subjective part of that mind is radically transcendent. It is not part of space-time. It is not arising as an object. It's the witness to all objects. And you find in this state that I that's radically transcendent has no borders and no boundaries and is always already ever present. And it's unborn. And therefore, being unborn means that it's undying. And so you find a place in you that is a witness to that gross body and ego mind that is going to die, that resides in space and time and will run out of time. But that enlightenment state, that awakening state, creates a transcendent self that is free from that gross body mind, free from the suffering, free from the death. This is what the Buddha discovered. This was the Buddha's nirvana. There is a core of my being that's radically transcendent to the manifest world. And that is classical enlightening. That is realizing that not ultimately, not just as a concept, but in self-identity, where your identity shifts to that timeless, eternal, unbound, unbordered, always already present, free, unconditioned part of the core of your being, which is the core which intersects the divine or the Godhead or pure spirit directly. And so there's a sense of God or the Godhead looking through your eyes in this state, and that the I, your own subjectivity, is being sourced from this ultimate consciousness beingness. And that is classical awakening or classical nirvana or enlightenment. And I just want to add one thing, is the unitary, that state starts to give way to an experience of the whole idea of subject and object starting to become somewhat obsolete, because you find that objects themselves have no existence without a subject. In fact, we define an object only because there's a subject that can set it apart from its own interiority or consciousness or subjectivity. And so, and the other side of that is equally true. There's no subject without an object. That's the only way we even have a term of subject or subjectivity, is that it's set apart from objectivity. So in this unitary state where this transcendent self starts to then flow into or integrate in this seamlessly underlying whole with all of phenomenon. And we're able to actually embrace the ego and the physical body and fall back in love with the world, knowing that we are both, and this is the big concept here, knowing that we are both free from it, radically transcendent to it, and at the same time immanent within it. And it's a both and, not an either or. And we can hold that identity of being radically free of the world and simultaneously in love with the world, in the world, and part of the world, and not other to the world. And that is really enlightenment. That is classical enlightenment with non-duality or the unitary state. Okay, one point I want to tease out of that. Here's the thing that we know now, and here's what also the traditions did not know or could not know. And some of this is understandings we have gained only through integral meta theory, developmental psychology, some of these deeper studies of what's happening as adults grow vertically through stages of their mind, not just states of awakening. So there are stages of development that humans go through. Everybody can think about a child growing, that they're going through. You see these different stages, right? At a certain point, they're completely illogical. And the reason they're illogical is the rational mind has not even emerged. That stage of development does not exist. So they have magical thinking and then mythical thinking before the rational mind emerges. So these are stages of vertical development. And so it is as adults. We move into these rational stages, then these pluralistic postmodern stages. And by the time an adult is 25, they usually stop growing vertically. And this vertical growth is how we are able to take those awakening states into the world, into our life, into our own finite body mind. But here's the thing about awakening. You can have an awakening experience at any vertical stage of development. It does not guarantee that you become more evolved. It will guarantee that you become more awake. But this is different than evolutionary stages. And this is a brilliant articulation, first really spotted by the genius philosopher Ken Wilber, who was able to tease apart this idea of these spiritual state awakenings from these developmental, psychological, or psycho-spiritual dimensions or stages, rather, that we grow through. So here's one of the hallmarks of our work, particularly when people go deeper in the past. We don't just want to help people wake up, right? We have Myanmar Buddhists, we have Buddhists in Myanmar, what was Burma, who are in what, for all practical purpose, from deep meditative practices, can be said to be in deep, accessing deep nirvanic states, awakening states. And I believe they are. They have the capacity to wake up to these transcendent free states. However, many of them stage of development is at an ethnocentric, traditional value stage in the mind, in the finite mind. And you take this awakening state, it's flowing through and being interpreted through this ethnocentric stage of development. And Myanmar Buddhists, many of them, are condoning, and not even condoning, but supporting the genocide of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, right? And yet they have these fully Enlightenment states. So what's going on here? Well, what's going on here is that they are waking up, but they are not growing up. And growing up is the vertical stages of evolution that can be catalyzed. And we have systems that specialize in what we call late stage adult development, because most people stop at either the modern or the postmodern stage of development. It's just how evolution has, it's just where evolution has gotten to so far. And we're trying to help it go beyond and catalyze these late stages of growing up. And to do that, we have to access, as we talked about earlier, the higher parts of the brain that are not only in corollary with these waking up states, but are in corollary with these higher growing up stages of development. And so when you have a awakening state and your center of gravity is ethnocentric, traditional, developmentally, it's interpreted and enacted on very differently than if you have the same state, the same waking up enlightenment state, but you have it from, let's say, a postmodern, multicultural mind. You will enact that and interpret that and behave very differently. So we have to wake up and we have to grow up if we really want to get there. One last thing. And to wake up and grow up fully, we have to clean up. And to clean up means that we have to do something with, and this is getting back to what you were pointing to, that shadow material, that repressed stuff, that emotional baggage, all of those operating systems below the conscious threshold that are not even getting up to conscious awareness until they rear their ugly head in some way in our life. And we have a way to help access that, not until it's safe and not until you've increased the neurological flexibility in the brain, the cognitive bandwidth in the mind, to be able to really process some of that old, deep emotional junk that hangs up in there. And we have a way for that to actually happen so that we can not only wake up, we can grow up. And to do so, we must clean up, or that stuff will pull down our waking up and pull down our growing up. So we have to clean up to fully wake up and grow up so that we can show up. And so the path is to be able to wake up, to grow up, to clean up, so that you can show up in the life process as a fully evolved and integrated human being that is in an evolutionary state of becoming. So
That is so awesome. uh,
I hope I answered your question in there.
you did. You did. Well, it's a nice overview because for me, and with the specifics, because it's helping to see the integration process. I think that point that you made about the awakening without the growing, you know, that's, I think, what I've experienced in my life.
Yes.
Personally and with others. It doesn't mean everybody. I'm just talking, I've been in these groups for 25 years, like thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And I'm just curious because that's my mind. I'm not, like I was saying, I'm not making judgments, but I want to see how are we evolving when we have everything we need to evolve. I can feel it in the core of my being, and that's why I wanted to have this conversation. But how are we actually doing it?
Yes.
So I think that leads into my next question of, like, how do we wake up and grow up?
Yeah. So here's, and I'm going to speak from obviously my perspective and the systems that I've developed based on the knowledge that I hold and the decades of research and creation and development. And I'm not trying to say this is the only way or the only path. It's the one that I'm going to speak to because it's the one that I know. And so one of the interesting things I found in almost all of those wisdom traditions, the esoteric paths of the wisdom traditions were not the paths available to the everyday worshiper or believer or that belonged to the religion or the spiritual movement. These were usually secret teachings, and they were often held in mystery schools, right? Mm-hmm. And it all required an intensive preparation period before they revealed that a core piece of this whole thing was an energy, a latent energy in the body, or a universal energy that could be brought into the body and mobilized. Yoga had prana and kundalini. Vajrayana, all of these sophisticated paths, all of them that I carefully examined. There's even now a body of research that believes the Holy Ghost in Christianity was this, in one way or another, energy inside the body, or that could be brought inside the body that could lead to Christ consciousness. But what I found was almost none of these systems had developed ways that were effective or what would the word be? Accommodating to the modern world and the modern mind, right? It's not practical. As the yogis used to say, okay, now that you're adult, leave your family, move to our community in the woods, sit in this cave, and look at your mind for 8 hours a day until you die. And they even, and I think that in so doing, they hit certain points that liberated this energy, whether it was, and depending on the yoga tradition, whether it was, kundalini prana, depending on the language and the tradition, the bottom line was an energy emerged. In fact, I'm even convinced from very, very deep study that the yoga asanas, the postures, came inside out. This energy started flowing through them when they spent these decades in meditation. It started to flow through them and they just followed it. And it was putting their body in these positions, as well as the mudras that were showing up were organically coming from the inside out. But the problem is that it was hard to reproduce and it was hard to teach, right? And you certainly aren't going to, in the modern world, get a lot of people to leave their families, move to the woods, sit in a cave for 40 years and use their mind to look at their mind. So what they tried to do, what yoga tried to do, and it's brilliant, but again, wasn't all that successful if the aim was samadhi, right? That's not happening for most people in modern yoga studios. But the aim was, if they couldn't figure out how to consistently mobilize this energy, that was part of the awakening process that they knew was in association with these movements of the body and these mudras. But what they did was say, well, why don't we reverse engineer this thing? And they started then trying to use the asanas, the mudras, the postures, the practices to liberate the energy. So they were going the opposite direction. And it had a certain level of success. But again, nothing had that consistency or integrative capacity, particularly not that we really need for the modern world. And so the point was, what I found is that there was an energetic component to all of these higher esoteric paths. And I started realizing the energetic component and the awakening state went together in some way. And then I started to realize that what was happening with some of these energetic awakenings that they couldn't have known was some of that energy was getting to the brain. But we did see 20th century realizers like Gopi Krishna, for instance, who had his energetic or kundalini awakening, calling it the evolutionary energy in man. And he had an intuition that it was getting to higher centers of his brain, right? And so what I set out to do then, I started to learn everything I could learn about energy work. I even went to school to get a doctorate of chiropractic to start exploring some of these offline or what energy work techniques and technologies, ancient ones, modern ones. And I started learning everything I could learn about energy. And I had this connection that this holy trinity here was this energy in the body, the awakening of the brain that led to the awakening of the mind. And that then the awakening of the brain and the awakening of the mind, we could develop practices that fed those back into each other that kept that evolution occurring. And so I started developing the technique that at first required hands-on facilitation by trained facilitators, professional trained facilitators, to mobilize this prana or chi, or I have a different name, I call it an inner organic technology that moves what we call salutogenesis within the body. Because I don't think it's exactly the same, but it's correlated to that ancient understanding of energy. But what I started to do was develop practices that could mobilize the energy in ways that we could further direct it specifically with the intention being, let's use it to activate, to awaken higher capacities of the brain and to shift that lower brain, stress brain, fear brain, survival brain, to shift its center of gravity over time into these higher structures. And I developed technologies, hands-on based technologies that would do that. And we started measuring them. We flew to LA. We had brain researchers doing the studies on this stuff. And we were seeing the most amazing changes in the brain and the most subjective awakenings happening in the people going through it. And that led me to the development of source code meditation, which I've now written a book around. It's translated into 4 languages currently. And it's led to online and community-based programs, online programs that we also host Zoom calls and community components that you're participating in, which is what led us together. And so we now have these ways that we teach to self-mobilize that energy to the brain. As we learn to energize that energy to the brain, as we learn to energize the higher capacities of the brain, we then learn to start introducing a specialized meditation to start using our mind once the brain starts awakening. So now we've got mind and brain working together, synchronizing, and that leads to these higher awakening states. And for me, as you said, that's just the beginning. Although it's revolutionary, it's just the beginning, because we want to go from that waking up to growing up, to cleaning up and showing up. And we have paths and practices to do that. In fact, we now have a university called the New Human University that if people really want to go on the deep path, it doesn't require giving up your family and moving to the forest or sitting in a cave for 8 hours, but it is a year-long commitment that takes us through the deepest teachings and practices of the waking up, growing up, cleaning up, showing up path, as well as a live portion of it that's just super powerful and transformative. So I'll stop there. You get me going, Julie, with these questions are so awesome. And I want to say thank you. I probably should, I mean, we're probably getting close to the end, but I want to say thank you right now for letting me kind of share my authentic self and my soul in this way, because sometimes some of it is kind of provocative, right? And I know that your deeper intuition and understanding of what these paths are really all about and what's possible is why we're together and why I'm on your conference. And so I just want to commend you and thank you for continuing on the path to get to that point, right? If there's no one that has ears to hear, I have no purpose in the world. I can't transmit or any knowledge or any practice. And it takes a certain, I think, openness and development and willingness and just knowledge base to always know there's more than we've got. And so thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's funny because I am obsessed with this topic, and I always have been my whole life. I can't imagine thinking about, talking about, or investigating anything more profound than what it means to be this human. And it's whatever it's going to take to wake it up, but that's the most important thing, is the integration, right? Because we've all had, whether we're conscious of it or not, like these waking up moments. Like I have deep intuition. I have this ability since I was born, and my mother will watch this and she'll know that I cannot do something if it doesn't resonate.
Yeah.
I have this visceral feeling inside when something isn't right. And then there's a lot of gray. And I've just been constantly refining it. And of course, that drew me to yoga and to Buddhism and to deep meditation and seeking samadhi, but it's not sustainable. Mm-hmm. I mean, I just happen to choose in this life not to be married and have kids and have a very unconventional life. But that is not for everybody. And all I want for everybody is to be happy, right? Because the reason I could make the choices that I've made in this life and be happy with them is because I could see the patterns of I think we're talking about it here is that lower brain energy is like how we are perpetuating life at a low frequency. And for me, that just wasn't going to cut it. I was like, oh no. I went through those deep, dark, they call them like dark nights of the soul when I was a young person, a very young person. And so that's my story, like what catapulted me into like seeking and investigating. And I really believe we are in this evolutionary process. So for me, it's so much more than just a waking up, because people are waking up to different things, like the idea that the government doesn't have our best interest in its paradigm. It's like, okay, and then all of a sudden, the bottom crashes out. But we are so much more than these bodies.
Yep.
And it's like, okay, so now how do we access that?
Yep.
And how do we access that in a sustainable way that works for the whole, the group? Because we're all connected, whether people are aware of that or not, because we're all made of the same stuff.
Yep.
But that brought me to kind of my next question is this thing that you talk about, this deep, soulful purpose that we all have. Mm-hmm. We're all born with this. But, even in my intro Upton video, I say, because this was my aha moment when I was a young kid, I was like, I'm not here to just go to school, be born, go to school, get a job. Like,
yep. There's more.
There's so much more. And, and people are always asking me, like, how do you do it? Like, how are you happy? Like, how do you live your life? How do you just do whatever you want? And it's like this.
Yeah.
I'm accessing that internal part of myself.
Yep.
That is, I'm allowing to inform me.
Yes. I love
and
that.
move from that place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So maybe, I know you talk about this in your work, about that deep purpose that we all have.
Yeah. So there's, again, just a quick summary. So there's waking up, or these enlightenment states that radically free us from everything that's happening in the world of form. They free us from our own body mind. We discover part of us that endures when the body mind drops. That part of us that never enters the stream of time. Everything that we know as objects, including our own body mind, and everything that we're attached to is going to die. And if we wrap our whole identity up in that, we're going to suffer. But if we know a part of ourselves that's free of that, there's only abiding peace there. That's all there is, this transcendent tranquility. And so having a relationship to that, I believe, is paramount in this crazy, chaotic, postmodern, post-truth world that we're trying to navigate. Having a relationship to the core of your being that never even enters into that, that's indestructible. It's crucial. But it doesn't stop there. That unitary experience lets us bring that transcendence back into the immanent world, back into the world of form, and fall in love with the world and fall in love with our lives, while simultaneously knowing that we're radically free of everything that's happening. And so as we evolve up these stages, one of the things that happen, even the great developmental psychologist Abraham Maslow developed this hierarchy of needs. I don't know if you remember this term in self-development, but where we went from these surviving needs at these earlier stages to these beingness needs. And then he discovered we had self-actualization and self-transcendence needs, which most people never get to, because they get hung up down here. And this is part of this whole spectrum of development, vertical development or evolutionary development. So as we're trying to make this shift vertically from our consciousness, which is usually in this kind of modern or postmodern bandwidth in our normal American or Western lives, let's say, right? This modernist, postmodern, we're trying to make this shift into these self-actualization and self-transcendence needs. The driver of that is purpose. It's purpose that provides the evolutionary fuel to take us beyond where we are. And in many of our programs, by design, what we call the authentic self is different than what we call the transcendent self. The transcendent self is that accessing that enlightenment state that's transcendent to everything that's arising, including our own body mind. But the authentic self is the part of us that is in time, that was born on a particular date and will die on a particular date. That part of us is in the world of form, and it starts to find that it has a purpose for being in the world of form. And it's the alignment of that evolutionary purpose. I call it the soul purpose. The soul purpose is what the authentic self uses for its fuel to go into the world and to live large, to live audaciously, to live with gusto, to live as though there might not be a tomorrow. To be able to fully flex one's purpose in the world is what generates that thrust, that movement into the next higher stage of human evolution. But it's hard to find that when you're trying to figure out how to pay your bills, when there's terrorist alerts on your radio, when COVID has you locked down in your house, when you're in a significant relationship that you're fighting 24 hours a day. It's hard to unleash that and live that. And so that's why we have to not only wake up and grow up, but clean up and show up. We have to be able to fully integrate this entity, this being, this authentic self that's being informed by that transcendent self, that free part of us, is still holding inside and outside of this finite being that realize that it's falling in love with the life process and that it has a destiny. It has a reason for being born. A quote I love by Mark Twain. He said, the two most important days in a person's life. Number one, the day they are born. And number two, the day they find out why they were born. Most people never get to two. Okay? The day they're born is exceptional. But the second birth is when you find out why you were born. And that's what a lot of my work is really designed to do, to help us wake up and to help us grow up by finding out why we were born and giving us the tools, the understandings, the praxis, the maps, the teachings to be able to bring that into, unapologetically bring that into the life process. So when the body mind does drop, we don't have regret. As what the research shows, the overwhelming majority of Western populations in the West die with regret. And they die with regret, not for what they did. They die with regret for what they did not do. And that is a tragedy.
Wow, it's true. We're in these bodies for such a short amount of time and we don't really know what comes next. So just to end it, because we didn't get into, well, how do we do this? Maybe just a short summary version of like how you go about helping people to like begin this journey from no matter where they're at. Um,
Sure. I will, and I suppose you'll have this listed somewhere, but we have a sourcecodemeditation.com website and the newhumanuniversity.com website, both of which introduce our programs and both of which have webinars that detail some of the key programs in more depth that are available for people to learn more than what I'm about to say. But the bottom line is that when we're not in a pandemic, we have a multitude of live events. We host one-day workshops across the country. We host 2-day retreats across the country. I'm leaving in 3 weeks for Mexico, where I'm hosting a 7-day retreat in Mexico. But we also have incredibly powerful online programs and online community, which you're participating in, as you mentioned earlier. And all of these, it's kind of like all roads lead to Rome for me. All of these technologies are designed to teach you ways to cue pathways in the body that liberate the subtle energy in a specific way that awakens or activates higher potential of your brain. And as you cultivate the ability to unlock this inner organic technology in you through our protocols that we teach you, as you cultivate the ability to mobilize this energy to your brain, it grows and grows and grows and grows. And usually in an online setting within about 4 weeks, we have learned to some degree to mobilize energy to the higher brain. And then we start teaching how to introduce the specialized meditation into that. And so as we wake up the brain, we use meditation to wake up the mind, and they have to go together. And we teach the way to do that. And that will create a lifetime practice that can be deepened and used forever. The tools to self-energize your higher brain, introduce a specialized meditation to wake up your mind. There's no limit to your ability to cultivate that, to advance that, and to use that as a lifetime practice. But however, since this is an evolutionary model, it doesn't have to end there. There's ways to go into other elements of the practices and teaching that help you use that awakened brain mind to fast track or direct it in all of these ways we just mentioned, to use that awakened brain mind to understand what's going on in your finances or your relationships or your physical body, and ways to use the awakened brain mind to make change specifically in those areas. And when you make change in those areas, it unlocks all of this energy. And then ways to discover that soul purpose and to self-actualize, to grow up in the real world, to develop to these higher stages. There's ways, it's all built upon first being able to wake up your brain and mind. Or whatever you try to do next just doesn't ever work. It's like why people go through so many life coaching programs and self-development programs and meditation techniques is they're putting it into a brain mind that's in a state of safety and defense and survival and doesn't even want to change. So it has to start with upgrading the brain mind to become flexible and receptive to whatever comes next. And we have a whatever comes next for you to discover how to change all areas of your life, how to self-actualize, how to authenticate, how to unleash that authentic self in the world, so that you not only wake up, but you grow up and you clean up and you show up. And it's all very carefully maybe isn't the right word, mindfully, through long periods of research and development. We have our own, we have a nonprofit now called the New Human Research and Development Institute. We produce research studies. We have a 129-page paper going through the review process right now, showing how the practices in the New Human University catalyze this late stage adult development. This is world changing research. 129-page paper where we're correlating these advanced brain changes that we measure in our institute with these higher mind changes, and we're publishing on this stuff. And so these aren't just kind of fancy words or arbitrary in nature. There's a whole body of science behind it. There's a whole body of research and development behind it. And there's a whole honoring and utilizing the best of what the wisdom traditions have given us and provided to us as part of the path forward.
That's awesome. Thank you so much for sharing with us today. I know I'm benefiting from it, so I'm really grateful that you could come on and share with this audience.
Awesome.
And continue to do your work, which is beneficial to all of us.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, Julie. It was a lot of fun. And to be honest with you, I am, as you know, I'm a pretty busy person with all of this going on, and I manage my time mindfully as well. And I don't take every interview opportunity that I have. I don't really care to be that public facing. Like, I have work to do, and I'm I'm in there doing it. And so I just wanted to say that what I'm trying to say is I'm grateful for you doing what you're doing and seeing the world like you're seeing it. And it's why I think we're synchronized and we're here right now.
Yes. And I got that so much because, so the audience, just to know, like, you're so hands-on, you're in every Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
Like, you don't just give the information and teach it and then walk away. Like, you are there, present, every step of the way. And, that's, to me, amazing. And I know I've gotten a lot out of it, and the community.
Yeah.
So the community is amazing because it's just people from all over the world.
All over the world.
With this beautiful passion, and going through so much, each of us, and just being able to share. So I just want to say thank you for your time and for your passion, and and just these beautiful teams of people you've put together in the community that you've created. It's so sincere.
Thank you.
It's so sincere.
Thanks for knowing.
Yeah.
Thanks for saying yes.
Yes. Yeah, I got the I got the message. Okay, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.